Hello everyone, DJ here. Today I'm going to talk about the funds within the Thrift Savings Plan. This is a popular topic for a lot of people, whether you are a civil service employee or a member of the military. And today I will give you a good explanation of what the funds are and how you can use them in your investments and retirement preparation. The particular investment options within the Thrift Savings Plan are called index funds. And to quote Investopedia.com, an index fund is a type of mutual fund with a portfolio constructed to match or track the components of a market index, such as the Standard & Poor's or S&P 500 index. An index mutual fund is said to provide broad market exposure, low operating expenses, and low portfolio turnover. These funds are designed, this is me talking again, these funds are designed to provide a degree of diversification and safety to your investment. I will describe each fund individually. I will also quote directly from tsp.gov, the Thrift Savings Plan website, in order to provide accurate information about each fund and to ensure a level of objectivity in my descriptions. Because obviously I have opinions, like everyone, about which fund is best and which is not. But in order to avoid that, I'll just quote tsp.gov. Let's begin. In fact, before I begin, let me say there's going to be a lot of reading in this episode, so please forgive me if I sound a bit stilted. It's just because I'm reading rather than using my own words. I'll let you know when I come back to being me again. So, let's begin. The G Fund. The objective of the G Fund is to produce a rate of return that is higher than inflation while avoiding exposure to credit or default risk and avoiding exposure to market price fluctuations. The investment strategy of the G Fund is to invest exclusively in a non-marketable short-term U.S. Treasury security that is specifically issued to the TSP. The earnings consist entirely of interest income on the security. Risks. The G Fund is subject to inflation risk, or the possibility that your G Fund investment will not grow enough to offset the reduction in purchasing power that results from inflation. Rewards. The payment of G Fund principal and interest is guaranteed by the U.S. government. This means that the U.S. government will always make the required payments. In other words, your G Fund investment is not subject to credit default risk. The G Fund interest rate calculation is based on the weighted average yield of all outstanding Treasury notes and bonds with 4 or more years to maturity. As a result, participants who invest in the G Fund are rewarded with a long-term rate on what is essentially a short-term security. Generally, long-term interest rates are higher than short-term interest rates. How can I use the G Fund in my TSP investment? Consider investing in the G Fund if you would like to have all or a portion of your TSP account completely protected from loss. If you choose to invest in the G Fund, you are placing a higher priority on the stability and preservation of your money than on the opportunity to potentially achieve greater long-term growth in your account through investment in the other TSP funds. This is me for a moment. This next bit might scare people, but don't be afraid. Do your own homework on this topic and your concerns will be allayed quite well, I think. Back to reading. The G Fund and the debt limit. The total amount of debt that the U.S. Treasury can issue to the public and to federal agencies is limited by law. In recent years, this limit and what to do when it has been reached has been discussed in the news with increasing frequency. What does it have to do with the G Fund? The G Fund is invested in short-term U.S. Treasury securities specially issued to the TSP. As a result, the G Fund can be affected when the statutory or legal debt limit is reached. However, the principal and interest payments on these securities are guaranteed by the U.S. government. When it reaches the debt limit, the Treasury has to find ways to manage its cash and borrowing so that it can continue funding government activities. One of the many ways it can do this is by suspending investments of the G Fund. As a G Fund investor, you should know that if the Treasury takes this action, your investment is always protected and your G Fund earnings are fully guaranteed by law under the Thrift Savings Plan Investment Act of 1987. Your G Fund account balance would be exactly the same from day to day as if it were invested in Treasury securities. It will continue to accrue earnings and be updated each business day, and loans and withdrawals will be unaffected. For more detailed information about how the G Fund is protected when the U.S. government reaches its debt limit, refer to the reports prepared by the Congressional Research Service and the Government Accountability Office. The F Fund. Fund objective. The F Fund's investment objective is to match the performance of the Bloomberg Barclays U.S. Aggregate Bond Index, a broad index representing the U.S. bond market. Investment strategy. The F Fund assets are held in a separate account and managed to track the Bloomberg Barclays U.S. Aggregate Bond Index. This broad index includes the U.S. government, mortgage-backed, corporate, and foreign government, issued to the U.S., sectors of the U.S. bond market. The earnings consist of the interest income on the securities and gains or losses in the value of the securities. The F Fund uses an indexing approach to investing. In other words, it is a passively managed fund that remains invested according to its investment strategy, regardless of conditions in the bond market or the economy. Back to me again. I know this sounds very complex and it can be confusing. I'm going to continue reading these descriptions as if you understand every word I'm saying, and as time goes on in future episodes, I'll break this down further in simpler words so that it's easier to understand. Right now, I just want you to get an introduction to these funds, and we can dive deeper into the topic on a later date. Back to the notes. The F Fund uses, already read that, risks. Because the F Fund returns move up and down with the returns in the bond market, your F Fund investment is subject to market risk. For example, when interest rates rise, bond prices, and thus the returns on the index and the F Fund, fall. Conversely, in an environment of falling interest rates, bond prices, as well as the index and the F Fund returns, rise. Pardon me, I'm hiccuping. As an F Fund investor, you are also exposed to credit default risk, or the possibility that principal and interest payments on the bonds that comprise the index will not be paid. The F Fund is subject to inflation risk, meaning your F Fund investment may not grow enough to offset the reduction in purchasing power that results from inflation. Your F Fund investment is also exposed to prepayment risk, which is the probability that if interest rates fall, bonds that are represented in the index will be paid back early, thus forcing lenders to reinvest at lower rates. Rewards. Although there are several types of risk associated with the F fund, the overall risk is relatively low in comparison to certain other fixed income investments in the market because the F fund includes only investment grade securities. As a result, F fund investors are rewarded with the opportunity to earn higher rates of return over the long term than they would from investments in short-term securities such as the G fund. How can I use the F fund in my TSP account? In periods of falling interest rates, the F fund will experience gains from the resulting rise in bond prices. So in the long run, you may expect F fund returns to exceed those of the G fund. However, you should also expect greater price volatility, up and down movements. It is also important to know that higher returns are not guaranteed. This is because losses may occur when interest rates are rising, causing bond prices to fall. The F fund can be used in a portfolio that also contains stock funds. This is because the prices of bonds and stocks don't always move in the same direction or by the same amount at the same time. So, a retirement portfolio that contains stock funds like the C, S, and I funds, along with the F fund, will tend to be less volatile than one that contains stock funds alone. The C fund. Fund objective. The C fund's investment objective is to match the performance of the Standard & Poor's 500, S&P 500 index, a broad market index made up of stocks of 500 large to medium-sized U.S. companies. Investment strategy. The C fund assets are held in a separate account and managed to fully replicate the Standard & Poor's 500 index. The earnings consist primarily of dividend income and gains or losses in the price of stocks. The C fund is a passively managed fund that remains invested according to its indexed investment strategy, regardless of stock movement or general economic conditions. Risks. Your investment in the C fund is subject to market risk because the prices of the stocks in the S&P 500 rise and fall. By investing in the C fund, you are exposed to inflation risk, meaning your C fund investment may not grow enough to offset inflation. Rewards. While investment in the C fund carries risk, it also offers the opportunity to experience gains from equity ownership of large and mid-sized U.S. company stocks. How can I use the C fund in my TSP account? The C fund can be used on a portfolio that also contains stock funds that track other indexes, such as the S fund, which tracks an index of small U.S. company stocks, and the I fund, which tracks an index of international stocks. The C, S, and I funds track different segments of the overall stock market without overlapping. This is important because the price of stocks in each market segment, don't always move in the same direction or by the same amount at the same time. By investing in all segments of the stock market as opposed to just one, you reduce your exposure to market risk. Pardon me, like I said, I'm trying to talk while dealing with hiccups. I'm trying to deal with those while talking, and sometimes it messes up my pace. All right. The C fund could also be useful in a portfolio that contains bonds. Again, it is because the price of stocks and bonds don't always move in the same direction or by the same amount at the same time. So, a retirement portfolio that contains a bond fund like the F fund, along with other stock funds like the S and I funds, will tend to be less volatile than one that contains stock funds alone. S fund. Fund objective. The S fund's investment objective is to match the performance of the Dow Jones U.S. Completion Total Stock Market Index, a broad market index made up of stocks of U.S. companies not included in the S&P 500 index. Investment strategy. The S fund invests in a stock index fund that tracks the Dow Jones U.S. Completion Total Stock Market Index. The earnings consist of dividend income and gains or losses in the price of stocks. The S fund uses an indexing approach to investing. In other words, it is passively managed but remains invested according to its investment strategy, regardless of conditions in the bond market or the economy. Risks. Your investment in the S fund is subject to market risk because the Dow Jones U.S. Completion Total Stock Market Index returns will move up and down in response to overall economic conditions. By investing in the S fund, you are also exposed to inflation risk, meaning your S fund investment may not grow enough to offset the reduction in purchasing power that results from inflation. Rewards. While investment in the S fund carries risk, it also offers the opportunity to experience gains from equity ownership of small to mid-sized U.S. companies. It provides an excellent means of further diversifying your domestic equity holdings. How can I use the S fund in my TSP account? The S fund can be useful in a portfolio that also contains stock funds that track other indexes, such as the C fund, which tracks an index of large U.S. company stocks, and the I fund, which tracks an index of international stocks. The C, S, and I funds track different segments of the overall stock market without overlapping. This is important because the price of stocks in each market segment, always miss that, don't always move in the same direction or by the same amount at the same time. By investing in all segments of the stock market, as opposed to just one, you reduce your exposure to market risk. The S fund can also be useful in a portfolio that contains bonds. Again, it is because the price of stocks and bonds don't always move in the same direction or by the same amount at the same time. So a retirement portfolio that contains a bond fund like the F fund along with other stock funds like the C and I funds will tend to be less volatile than one that contains stock funds alone. Me again, for those who may not know, a portfolio is simply your particular set of investment funds, be they individual stocks, indexes, mutual funds, things like that. All of that together comprises a portfolio. Think of it like an artist portfolio or a photographer's portfolio. It's just a collection of items representing your work, or in this case, your investment value. Back to the article. I fund. The I fund's investment objective is to match the performance of the MSCI EAFE Europe, Australia, Far East Index. The I fund invests in a stock index fund that fully replicates the MSCI EAFE index. The earnings consist of gains or losses in the price of stock, dividend income, and changes in the relative value of currencies. The I fund uses an indexing approach to investing. In other words, it is a passively managed fund that remains invested according to its investment strategy, regardless of stock market movements or general economic conditions. Risks. Your investment in the I fund is subject to market risk because the MSCI AEFE index returns will move up and down in response to overall economic conditions. Because of its exposure to currency risk, the EAFE index and the iFund returns will rise and fall as the value of the US dollar decreases or increases relative to the value of the currencies of the countries representing the index. By investing in the iFund, you are also exposed to inflation risk, meaning that your iFund investment may not grow enough to offset the reduction in purchasing power that results from inflation. Rewards. While investment in the iFund carries risk, it also offers the opportunity to experience gains from equity ownership in non-US companies. Because it represents the stock of companies in many developed countries, excluding the US, it is an excellent way to diversify the stock portion of your TSP allocation. How can I use the iFund in my TSP account? The iFund can be useful in a portfolio that contains stock funds that track other indexes, such as the C Fund, which tracks an index of large U.S. company stocks, and the S Fund, which tracks an index of small U.S. company stocks. The C, S, and I funds track different segments of the overall stock market without overlapping. This is important because the price of stocks in each market segment don't always move in the same direction or by the same amount at the same time. By investing in all segments of the stock market as opposed to just one, you reduce your exposure to market risk. The iFund can also be useful in a portfolio that contains bonds. Again, it is because the price of stocks and bonds don't always move in the same direction or by the same amount at the same time. So a retirement portfolio that contains a bond fund, like the F Fund, along with other stock funds, like the C and S funds, will tend to be less volatile than one that contains stocks alone. All right, we're back to me again. I originally planned this episode to be a single episode about all of the funds, but we're only halfway through and we're already over 20 minutes long. So I'm going to cut this episode a bit short and continue with the rest of the funds in another episode. So please join me next week when I'll talk about the life cycle funds within the Thrift Savings Plan. If you have questions about what I've said or just want to complain about how I read the same thing over and over, please comment in the comment section below. And if you have any questions, of course, post those in the comments section as well. Once again, thank you for joining me. Have a great day. And of course, thank you for your service.
If you liked what you heard on today's episode, then please go below and give it a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe to this channel. Also, please let other people know about this channel and the information it can provide for them. If you have questions or comments, then have no qualms about posting them in the comments section below. Please remember the RCRetirement YouTube channel and the RCRetirement website are not recognized or endorsed by the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, or any other government agency. The information presented in these resources are for entertainment and informational purposes only. Also, the content of either of these resources should not be considered financial or legal advice. Please consult with your own legal counsel, accountant, and financial planner before making any decisions based on what you have learned here. As always, thank you for watching the RC Retirement YouTube channel.